We will be discussing the problem of energy sources that harm the environment in the context of the different ways we think different countries should deal with it. 70% of the energy consumed by China and 80% of the electricity produced there is generated using coal. This means that China is essentially dependent on coal for its energy needs. Demand for energy and thus coal is expected to increase along with China's economy in the coming years. Coal use has caused much environmental degradation in China. It contributes to climate change and many other problems there. The country's CO2 emissions increased at a rate of almost 6% from 1990 to 2006. In 2007, coal mines emitted almost 18 billion cubic meters of methane into the atmosphere, and in the same year, Chinese industry in general emitted 9.9 million tons of soot. This air pollution has significantly impacted air quality across China and has made it clear that the country is in need of a safer, renewable, and more environmentally friendly energy source.
As the world's economies take a turn for the worse, Brazil's economy is continuing to grow. This economical and industrial growth will prove to demand more in terms of energy, a demand that must be met for rural farming communities in northeastern Brazil, namely the state of Piauí. Being the poorest of the Brazilian states, Piauí is located on top of the dry savanna-like Cerrado ecosystem. With the majority of all the energy in Brazil coming from hydroelectric power, it must be understood the damages that can be caused by the massive reservoirs required to give hydroelectricity the guise of being reliable. Not only is there possibilities of human and animal displacement when building these dams, the vegetation at the bottom of the reservoirs can cause serious ecological damage. It is apparent that in the Cerrado of Piauí, poor rural farmers need a source of energy that will minimize ecological damages, use minimal amounts of precious land, and not interfere with their water supply.
Chicago is the top-ranked fastest-growing cities in the world. With an enormously growing population comes the necessity for energy. The majority of electricity that is produced in Chicago comes from coal-fired power plants. There are 32 coal-fired power plants, ranking it as the fourth highest city in the United States of power being produced. With the United States currently having over 600 coal-fired power plants, it essentially is continuing to affect our nation's environment in several negative ways. As of 2004, the state produced over 31 million short tons of coal. There is an abundant amount of pollution affecting the city of Chicago as well as the surrounding area, including Lake Michigan. In addition to coal causing air pollution, it has been harming several different species, including various types of bats.
China is exploring several alternative energy sources. The one that I believe to be the country's best bet is nuclear energy.
Brazil has been a world leader in renewable energy resources, but in the case of supplying rural families in the state of Piauí, biofuels are my solution of choice.
I believe Chicago, Illinois would have the most success with wind power because it is the windy city and has many tall skyscrapers which induce airflow and draft.
There are many reasons why China should pursue nuclear power. For one, once plants and related infrastructure have been constructed, it is inexpensive. In the US, where nuclear infrastructure has been developed, electricity generated via nuclear plants costs about 1.9 cents per kilowatt compared to electricity produced with coal at more than 3.5 cents. Another advantage of nuclear power is that it is relatively sustainable compared to fossil fuels. Also, its efficiency has been increasing due to technological advances. Nuclear plants take up little land and can be built close to where electricity is most needed. They are also very dependable, which is important because China relies on its manufacturing industry.
While the state of Piauí has little money to use towards infrastructure development, they were given a loan of $350 million to be used towards agricultural development and youth education in the vacations. This money could be used to promote biomass and biogas agricultural programs. While biomass and biogas energy is most efficiently implemented on a small scale, it would not be hard to find a farmer with a capitalistic mindset who would be willing to produce, refine, and transform biofuels into electricity to help supply his community with a reliable, renewable energy. Not only will this be a cheap and effective way to supply rural poor farmers with energy, it will also cause for another method for economic growth.
The concept of wind power is one of the greenest forms of generating renewable energy. It is more cost efficient than solar energy, and at this point Chicago isn't ready to convert to nuclear energy. If they were to convert to wind power, they could put wind turbines on buildings and mount them between skyscrapers. For the outer suburbs, they could mount them on hills and wherever there is extra space. By placing wind turbines between buildings, it would essentially be effective in creating enough draft between the buildings to have the wind turbines working correctly. The overall cost per unit of energy produced is similar to the cost for new coal and natural gas installations, but wouldn't have a negative impact on the environment.
The cost of nuclear power in the state of Piauí would be one of its biggest limiting factors in implementing that type of system, as it is Brazil's poorest state. Also, according to a poll taken a year ago, in March of 2011, 54% of the Brazilians asked in said poll said that they did not approve of the use of nuclear power following the failures of the Fukushima reactor after the deadly tsunami.
I believe nuclear energy will not work in the city of Chicago, Illinois for several different reasons. First of all, there is not enough funding from the city to create a nuclear power plant. Second, the public view on nuclear energy isn't motivating. There are concerns over health hazards for building a nuke plant in the city of Chicago. Nuclear power plants have the potential to produce radiation in the surrounding area. Finally, there is no place to store nuclear waste. Chicago is much too populated to have anywhere to dispose of its nuclear waste.
Why doesn't China use biomass? Well, it is not as efficient or reliable as nuclear power. Though nuclear power is expensive at first, since China has the necessary capital, the increased efficiency is worth it. Also, China needs its arable land to grow food and doesn't have much to spare for biomass. While biomass could work well for a weaker, less centralized government, since China is essentially an oligarchy, nuclear, which requires a strong government, makes more sense. Also, farms have to be in the country where, as mentioned before, nuclear plants can be built where they are most needed, by cities and manufacturing areas.
The concept of biofuels will not work for energy production in Chicago for several different reasons. There is not enough land and too many metropolitan areas in Chicago, Illinois, and its surrounding areas. To create biofuels, there needs to be an open, non-populated land for agriculture use. Essentially, biofuels are not as efficient as wind power. It takes a lot more manpower than having a self-sufficient wind turbine that will generate renewable energy around the clock. In addition to this, there is nowhere to store enough animal waste that would be used to power the entire city of Chicago.
Why shouldn't China pursue wind power? Well, wind farms must be built where there is wind, which is not necessarily where the electricity they produce is needed. Transferring said electricity to where it is used requires the construction of extra infrastructure, which adds to its final cost. Windmills themselves are also fairly expensive, especially for China, which has to import certain parts which it doesn't have the technology to manufacture domestically, at least on a large scale. Another reason is that wind is not reliable enough to power China's manufacturing industry. If the wind stops blowing, electricity stops being produced.
As far as implementing wind-generated electricity in rural Piauí, the cost would supersede an acceptable budget for that state, as it is Brazil's poorest state. Also, the amount of land required for implementing a wind turbine system would compete directly with the fragile Cerrado ecosystem and compete with land use for farms, not to mention the difficulties in transporting said energy to other rural communities.